Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our program, meet the director of the Oscar-nominated film Inside Out. Plus, a troubling underground existence on the Mexican border. But first, Governor Jerry Brown talks with us about criminal justice reform and where he stands on questions of crime and punishment. This is Brown's fourth term as governor. During his first tenure almost 40 years ago, he signed a tough-on-crime bill that he now calls an abysmal failure.
Prison is punishment. You put someone in a cage and you leave him there and then you let him out. Now, while he's there, you can give him training, you can teach him how to read and write, fix cars, maybe get some skills, but there's a very coercive element. And when you introduce rehabilitation and you overemphasize that concept, it often turns into being a very manipulatory, exploitive, discriminatory tool.
Many say the law led to decades of explosive growth in our prison population. Now, the governor is pushing a ballot measure to allow nonviolent inmates to potentially get out of prison sooner. It would also change who decides whether young defendants should be tried as adults or juveniles. Scott Shafer sat down with Governor Brown this week to talk about his change of heart.
Governor Brown, thanks so much for talking to us. We are, as you know, in the midst of a national conversation about criminal justice reform. There's even some bipartisan agreement. And in comes your proposal for sentencing reform. How do you see it fitting into this larger national conversation?
Well, it fits in this sense that it's part of a reaction to the 30-year prison building binge. Somewhere in the 70s, with increasing acceleration through the 80s and 90s, most of the states, many of the countries of the world, went on a lock-em-up binge. The increases in many places were as much as 500%, far exceeding, probably by 4 times what the crime rate increase was, or much less the population. It's a natural reaction to put back into the system some careful provisions that will incentivize better prisoner behavior. The long fixed sentence where there's no opportunity for rehabilitation, education, mental health treatment, drug treatment, that's a very benighted approach, which is now being reversed and supported by Republicans, conservatives, as well as Democrats and liberals.
And this, what you're proposing, would undo part of what you signed as governor the first time. And I'm wondering, when you signed it, what did you think you were solving? What problem were you solving?
I was aware that some of the sentences by the parole board, some of the decisions, came up with disparate results. So some would be kept a lot longer than others, and people were alleging racial disparities. There was also, I had started to try to put more certainty into the process. I thought clarity and certainty of prison time would operate as a deterrent. My sentencing measure was relatively modest, but right after it was signed, the legislature started increasing prison time. For example, murder 1 was 7 to life, then it went to 25 to life, then they added enhancements of 25 and even 40 years. So now you get sentences of 60 and 70 years, whereas before you had a tenth of that. There was an overreach. Sometimes when you have a problem, you overcorrect. And what happened here was not just that we switched from an indeterminate to a determinate sentence, but every year thereafter, the next 4 governors added things called enhancements. There are now 400 separate enhancements that can add up to 25 years, each one of them. And now you have over 5,000 separate criminal provisions. This is unheard of when you really compare the 10 commandments that have stayed at 10 for 2,700 years and the law of California, which is basically stable for 60 years. And then they went on kind of a motorized legislative rampage where you just got more and more time, more and more prisons, and the result was a greater threat to public safety because families were broken up, and when people came back, they had no rehabilitation, no skills, and were very disoriented.
You mentioned race, and that was one of the reasons you felt there was some racial disparity, so you thought bringing some certainty to it might eliminate that.
Yes.
What's your view of race in the criminal justice system?
Well, race is very much connected to life opportunities and economics. And so those at the bottom are predominantly people of color, and they're the people in our prisons. Now, there are some Caucasians, and there are some people that may be a bit middle class, but the vast majority of people locked up are poor, are black, are Latino, are Asian in certain cases. So, look, the idea, this is kind of a one-note system now. Time in a cell. Time in the cell. Now, what we need is a more sophisticated system of restorative justice, drug treatment, mental health treatment, supervision, electronic monitoring, different ways of restructuring the thinking and reintegrating the offender, because they all come back anyway. And when you put them in the cell and you give them no incentive for them to take charge of their lives by getting an earlier freedom date, then they join gangs, they use dope, they get into violence, and there's no way to control the prisons because there's no internal incentive. And what my measure does, it brings back the ability of a convict to say, okay, if I play by the rules, if I get out of the gang, I can actually get home earlier. And then you add to that, and if I take high school training, if I take vocational training, if I do college, if I do mental health, drug treatment, all that helps. So what we're doing is building a system of internal incentives to get people to be better citizens when they inevitably come back to society.
One of the other things this ballot measure would do is when juveniles are involved, it would take the decision whether to try them as adults or juveniles away from the prosecutors and give it to the judges. Why do you think that's important?
Because the job of a prosecutor is to prosecute, not judge. The job of a judge is to judge. And whether someone 14, 15, 16, or 17 should be tried in the juvenile court under that system or transferred to the adult court is primarily a judicial question. Let the judges decide.
You have appointed 300 or so judges in California. And one thing I've noticed is that you've appointed more people who were either public defenders or had defense attorney experience, much more so than any recent governor. Why? And how do you think that's going to change the calculation and recalibrate?
First of all, we never had a tradition that said to be a judge, you have to be a district attorney. That developed probably in the 90s. The judges are supposed to be independent. You want judges who have commercial background, you want judges who have prosecutorial background, but city attorney, you want a diversity. And I've tried to look at the merits, and I think most people would say that the quality of the bench and the judiciary is definitely very good in the numbers that I've appointed.
How concerned are you that the DA's association has already come out against this? Yeah. Crime victims groups will be against it. How concerned are you about this being, and you being, portrayed as soft on crime?
Well, that is the line. This is an old story. My father ran for Attorney General. His Republican opponent took out a full-page ad in the San Francisco Examiner with a hypodermic needle, trying to portray my father as the friend of dope dealers. And that was in the 50s. So, yeah, there will be campaigns, but I've been around a lot of campaigns, and I think people want fairness, they want public safety. So I think you're going to hear a lot of hyperbolic rhetoric. But the fact is that the provision that I'm proposing is essentially what we're already doing under the 3-judge panel, for which nobody's really complained. And secondly, it is a modest adjustment in that it gives incentives after serving a full term in people that can demonstrate they're ready to go back into society. Doesn't mean they will. Siran is eligible for parole, but he's not getting out. He was denied just this last week. The same of other people. What you want to do is provide the incentives for real transformation. You
mentioned the 10 Commandments earlier, and of course you have Jesuit training. And I'm wondering how your religious faith, your religious teachings, thoughtfulness about religion and justice, how has that affected the way you think about all these things?
Well, I certainly have been brought up with the idea of forgiveness and redemption. The essence of Christianity is redemption. That's Jesus Christ, the Redeemer. That's what it's all about. So those who say, once you commit certain crimes, you are forever, for 10, 20, 30, 50, 70, 80 years, that's it. that really does run afoul of not only Christianity, but our whole American tradition, and just plain common sense. Because the proposition of the DAs is, we know on the day we charge, or on the day of the judge sentences, everything that can occur, we know all we need to know for the next 50 years. And all I'm saying is, you might have had some very good ideas there in the charges and the verdict that came in. But over the passage of time, men change, women change. And those changes ought to be accommodated so that we can open up the cells for new people that are even more dangerous.
Redemption is an idea that you've just mentioned, and I'm wondering if you say that signing the law was a mistake. And I'm wondering if now this is a kind of redemption you're seeking for yourself, to try to fix something, fix a mistake.
You know, when I look at it, I think the mistake in the determinate sentencing is that it takes away all incentive for a man to take charge of his life. Even though now I see the determinate sentencing as having real infirmities, that law, if they left it there, would have been very different than the law we have. The law we have literally has been encumbered with thousands and thousands of new legal prescriptions and rules. And that has made it not only unfair, it's made it unworkable, it's made it a danger to public safety, and it's made it extremely hard to administer. You
were governor 35 years ago, and you have an unusual opportunity to look back now, including at this law that you signed in 1976. What is that like to be able to look back and you as a young man signing these laws? We live in a different time now.
So I would say this, that we do have more wisdom. Over time, well, the world changes, and we have to adapt, and we have to learn from the past how to make our present better. And I can say this, law tends to get complicated. Law is getting more prescriptive.
And then last question, what's your take on the presidential election?
I think the turbulence, the polarization, the completely discordant views, unfortunately are reflective of the American society today. There's a great deal of concern, even fear, even anger, and that's being expressed by the political leaders who are trying to seek the presidency.
Any regrets you're not running?
Not really, but I think about it.
Just a little.
Just a little.
Governor Brown, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Turning now to the California-Mexico border, a troubled underworld in the town of Tijuana has officials concerned. Below the surface of the streets, there's a network of sewage tunnels where hundreds of people live. Some say they have nowhere else to go. Many say they're homeless because they've been deported from the U.S. Jean Guerrero has this report from San Diego public television station KPBS.
Aquí arriba. Pues aquí estamos en una alcantarilla. ¿Verdad? Y aquí vivo porque pues como soy inmigrante yo aquí pues y no tengo la manera de estar en un lugar mejor. Nos miran allá abajo y nos levanta la policía.
Jose Alberto Zavala is known as Chapo, like the Mexican drug lord, because of his short stature. But the similarities pretty much end there.
Es niña,
He recently rescued this cat from the side of the road.
Ya me golpeé el otro día porque me querían llevar para allá para adentro, pero eso es un secuestro. Eso es, mira, lo que hacen aquí atenta contra tus derechos humanos, mujer. Mientras el vagabundo no ofenda a nadie, no agreda a nadie, no le falte respeto a nadie, ellos deben de dejar. No, pues llegan los señores oficiales y llegan así con las pistolotas, así, con metralletas, como si fuera uno el Chapo Guzmán.
Chapo is one of hundreds of migrants living inside the Tijuana River Canal's tunnels, months after the government forced them out of a homeless encampment known as El Bordo and into rehab centers. Officials say the migrants were hurting tourism and committing crimes. Many were using heroin or methamphetamine after being deported from the U.S., where they had families and jobs. But some, like Chapo, say they don't do drugs at all. Even some of those were shipped to rehab. Since then, hundreds have escaped or were released from these facilities. Police continue arresting them, placing them back in rehab, in jail, or on buses out of town. Police raids of the canal are sometimes proving fatal.
Un hombre que cruzó corriendo por la vía rápida poniente fue atropellado y
The
falleció.
canal is flanked by Tijuana's busiest highways, and when the migrants run from the police, some are killed by cars speeding past. Just this month, at least 2 were killed trying to escape police. In a nearby part of the canal on a recent Friday night, about 40 migrants gathered around campfires in the dark. They agreed to be interviewed, but asked us not to show their faces because they were afraid of police retaliation. A migrant who called himself Carlos Francisco says he'd been run over by a car while running across the highway during a police raid 2 days prior. He was injured so badly he couldn't walk.
Ay, no, una cobija, nada, por favor. Ay, tengo 2, 3 días, voy para 2 días, 3 con el de ahora, porque vienen y nos agarran, nos golpean.
Another man had a large gash on his head from where he says police threw him against the asphalt during the same raid. Back in Chapo's part of the tunnel, he remembers some of his most recently killed friends.
Hace como un mes, un amigo mío que era el 18, sí, me dejó la policía y lo mató un carro. Ahí tengo la cruz. Ahí. Porque por su culpa, miran cómo han matado amigos míos. Al 18, al Chapitas, al de Oaxaca. Pero no sé por qué.
He says the police sometimes arrest migrants when they're just standing on the street, trying to find work in construction or other hard labor.
This is the stats that we used to have.
Tijuana's police chief Alejandro Lares denies arresting migrants who are just trying to find work. He says police detain only those migrants who are committing crimes, including sleeping in the canal, which is federal property. He says he plans to flush everybody out of the canal in the coming weeks.
Oh, that's actually a phase 2, a phase 3. We're going to take over the whole ravine on Tijuana.
Lares says he's ordered 14 all-terrain vehicles to patrol the canal. He expects them to arrive any day now.
It's a no man's land. So for that, it's easier for them to buy drugs, sell drugs, and obviously to consume drugs.
When asked about alleged police beatings, he says migrants should file complaints so that he can investigate.
I'm not going to tolerate any abuse from an officer to a citizen.
He says police can't be blamed for those migrants who die crossing the highways. He says those are under the influence of substances, not being provoked by police.
Sí.
Back in the tunnels, Chapo says experience has taught migrants how to time their dashes across the highway just right. The migrants also look after each other, stopping those who are under the influence from crossing the highways. He says it's when the police come that they panic.
No tienen corazón, güerita. No tienen corazón ellos para no sé cómo nos miran, pues.
In Chapo's opinion, the current strategy of flushing the migrants out of the canal makes life so difficult for them that they have no choice but to turn to petty crimes.
Llegan y 2, 3 patadones y una zapatilla y vamos para arriba. ¿Por qué? Porque no tienes credencial y no tienes que estar durmiendo aquí. ¿Y dónde quieres que duerma si no me dejas trabajar? ¿Dónde quieres que duerma? Si voy a juntar botes, me levantas. Si voy a los contenedores, me levantas. ¿Qué? ¿Que por qué andan muy grosso? Porque pues no das chance ni de bañarse. ¿Sí? ¿Qué quieres que haga, señor oficial?
He says he doesn't think Tijuana officials will ever succeed in clearing the canal of homeless migrants.
Esta es frontera y siempre va a haber inmigrantes. Siempre va a haber.
Yet bloodstains on the highway suggest a dying struggle. Jean Guerrero, KPBS News.
A tough situation for all involved. Well, now to something lighter. The Oscars are around the corner. Anger, disgust, joy, fear, and sadness. We all know those feelings. In the animated film Inside Out, those emotions are portrayed as unique individuals living inside our heads. The film was produced by Pixar Studios, based right here in the Bay Area, and is now up for 2 Academy Awards. Joining us now is the director of Inside Out, Pete Docter. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Well, congratulations on the latest Oscar nominations. This brings your total to 8 in all, I believe.
8 nominations, yes.
Does it feel as good as the first time?
Yeah, oh, it's always a complete like, what? How did I get here? So it's very fun.
Oh, you know, my daughter was 8 at the time when we saw Inside Out, and we both loved the movie. It was one of those wonderful cross-generational kinds of movies. Where do you get your inspiration from?
Well, in this case, I started with my daughter, who was about 11 when I was starting on this project. And I don't know, did you ever see the film Up?
Yes, we loved Up, which won an Oscar, by the way.
Yeah,
congratulations on that.
My daughter did the voice of young Ellie at the beginning. So there's that girl who says, it's like America, but South. You remember that sort of little spirited kid? And my daughter was a lot like that character. And then she turned 11, and things started changing. And this is very familiar to me, too, because I went through the same thing. That childhood to adulthood transition is difficult. And that's really what sparked the whole movie.
And so your daughter, once again, inspired Inside Out. She inspired Up, but also Inside Out.
Yeah, well, and that's true of like Monsters, Inc. was kind of inspired by watching my son. That was our first child, my wife and I had. And I had been really all about work. I warned my wife about that when we got married, because I love animation.
Anyway.
She did. She knew what she was getting into. But we'd spend long hours there at work. And now, suddenly we had a kid, and I was like, wait, I want to be at home, but I still want to be at work. And that's what became the story of Sullivan in Monsters Incorporated. So I think being a parent, who you are as a person gets into the work, and there's not been really anything I can think of that's affected me more than being a parent.
Well, let's see how some of that experience affected Inside Out. We have a clip. Let's take a look.
It was amazing. Just Riley and me forever. For 33 seconds.
I'm Sadness.
Oh, hello. I'm Joy. So, can I just, if you could, I just want to fix that. Thanks.
So I'm curious, what kind of kid were you? You're from Minnesota. I lived in Minnesota for some time too. Duluth, Minnesota for 4 years. So I have a little bit of familiarity with that area.
I was a kid who was pretty quiet, pretty shy, so I spent a lot of time on my own drawing. And I think it was probably my social awkwardness that got me into this business, because for me it was easier to draw someone than to talk to them. That's the scary part, is the social interaction. So that's kind of where I came from, and then parlaying that into movement. I loved when I figured out how to do flip books, like in the corner of your math book or something, which I wouldn't recommend for kids at home, because then you have to go back and erase all that. But if you get just like a 50-cent piece of like Post-it notes or something, you can make really nice little flip books out of those. And that's what got me into animation.
So then, what were some of the challenges of making Inside Out, going back to that movie? How did you balance the humor and the joy with the heartbreak of leaving childhood behind and growing up? Because some of the scenes were even intense for adults.
Well, that's good. I mean, as we start making these movies, I'm really thinking about, to be honest, I'm being a little selfish. I want I want to find some interest in this and go, all right, I'm going to work on this film for probably like 4 or 5 years. There better be something compelling and interesting and engaging for me to continue to be interested in it. So we really almost focused to adults first, knowing that kids are going to see it, so we can't put in anything that's inappropriate or not understandable or what have you. But it's really, that's our process.
And even in Toy Story, I think the character Buzz Lightyear, you kind of based that character on yourself, right?
Well, to some degree, okay, so it would be disingenuous for me to claim credit for anything here, because we have an amazing staff of people that do all the design work and the animation and voice work. So you're collaborating with all these people. But I was the supervising animator on Toy Story, and so often you'd look in the mirror and kind of copy the expressions to put into the character. That's just what animators do.
So Buzz Lightyear's expressions, some of them were from you.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. You started at Pixar when you were 21, a day after you graduated from college. Dream job, right? How did you get that?
Well, at the time, nobody knew what Pixar was. If you'd heard of it, it was probably because you knew of image computers that Pixar was making. So it wasn't really like this, oh, I hope I get a job there. It was kind of like, Pix, what? So I grew with the company. You know, this was before we had made any feature films. They were just starting to do commercials. And that's when I started on. We got to do some of the early commercials that Pixar did, and then grow with the company. And a lot of times people say, oh, I would love to work at Pixar. And I always think, you know, if you find a smaller studio, you will be able to contribute more. You'll have to do the design work and the story work, and like I did for Toy Story. So
that's a good point, and it's how you learn. Well, what's next in the pipeline for you?
Next at the studio, we have Finding Dory, which comes out this summer. It's the sequel to Finding Nemo. And then after that, man, we have more stuff going on now than we have in a long time. I'm back in development, working with Jonas Rivera, who produced Up and Inside Out, and we're working on another original thing.
Where do you see the future of animated films? Will we see big changes or just minor tweaks here and there in the next 5 to 10 years?
I had my first year story guy, and he was also had a story at Pixar. His name was Joe Rampt, and he used to say, it's called showbiz for a reason. It's part show, part biz. So really the answer to that question, I think, a lot determined by what people want to see, where our audience is looking. If they want to see more action adventures, then you'll probably get more of that. For me, I'm hoping, as Pixar has, we can continue to try to expand the boundaries of what people think of as animation. It's a genre. Sorry, it's not a genre, it's a medium, right? So animation could do horror movies, we could do science fiction, we could do any number of things, and hopefully we will.
Well, I get a feeling it's going to be fabulous regardless of what you decide. Thank you so much for coming in again.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations, 8 Oscar nominations. Phenomenal.
Thanks.
Pete Docter with Pixar. And that is it for us. I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks so much for watching. For all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org.